Hello and welcome to a special episode of To The Point on India's 68th Independence Day. This morning, Prime Minister Modi delivered his first speech from the ramparts of the Red Fort. It was an occasion the country has awaited with great expectations. So tonight we ask, did Mr. Modi live up to those expectations? Did he lay out a vision and an agenda that can inspire the country? And has he left behind his own imprint on the political discourse of India? Those are some of the many questions we shall seek to answer over the next 1 hour. And I have with me a special star-studded panel of guests. They are the well-known author and former editor Shobha De, former Army Chief General Ved Prakash Malik, former President of CII and Vice Chairman of Ashok Leyland R. Sheshasai, one of India's foremost academics from Shiv Nadar University, Professor Dipankar Gupta, the doyen of Indian advertising Alik Padamsee, and the Vice Chairman and Editor-in-Chief of the India Today Group, Shekhar Gupta. Shobha De, how would you describe the Prime Minister's first speech from the ramparts of the Red Fort? Is there a single word that immediately comes to your mind?
Well, the single word that jumped out at me, because there was a reference to it more than once, was Izzat. Now, I think that's a very powerful word. It's a very emotional word. And when he talked about dignity to the poor, I think it was the right thing to be saying. It reached out to the masses. But on the whole, if I were to rate the address, it was nowhere compared to his earlier address, which had given India and him and his party that immortal line about Achhe Din. So it wasn't as Achhe and as Acha as I would have liked it to be, the speech. The one word that, as I mentioned, is that's very good from the point of view of women of India. I'd say there'll be millions of women today who will thank him for including them. This is probably the first time that a Prime Minister has thought of including women and making them the centerpiece. In a way, a lot of time was invested in the safety of women and telling India how it should change its mindset, particularly where the sons of India are concerned, the men of India are concerned, and raising responsible sons. So two good points, but a lot of it left much to be desired.
Mr. Sheshasai, I'm going to ask you also for your first impressions, and I'll come after that to broad aspects of the speech one by one. Many people believe that this speech was a moment for inspiration and vision. Do you think Mr. Modi delivered inspiration and vision, or do you think it fell short?
You know, I must unabashedly say that the more I hear the Prime Minister speak, the more I'm converted. And I'm convinced that he has a very comprehensive vision of the new age India. I saw several missing pieces of the puzzle being put in place in this speech. The issue relating to the manufacturing zones, issue relating to the digital world, all of that. I think it's his vision of a modern new age India which will sort of jump over all the issues of caste and regionalism and all of that. There was clearly a very well articulated vision, and I think we had some bit of profound statement, some bit of particulars, some dream, some detail. I think it was very well balanced. I was very impressed.
General Malik, still sticking to the big picture, I noticed that the Prime Minister spoke extempore, although he did have notes with him. He spoke for 65 minutes and he did without the bulletproof screen for cover. Would you say this was a command performance for a man doing his first speech from the Red Fort?
Karan, beside the fact that, well, he did not use any bulletproof glass in front, but I thought it was a very effective speech which connected him very well with the common man and the common woman. And he was able to convey his message regarding developmental issues, regarding governance, regarding social issues quite effectively in the language that a common man and a common woman in our country would understand. So I would call it quite effective, his speech from the rampart, his first speech, which was extempore.
Picking up on that point, Dipankar Gupta, I want to talk a little about the Prime Minister's style and his delivery. I noticed it was informal, it was conversational, he seemed to be speaking directly to the people, and he was often, I thought, educating them, as Jawaharlal Nehru used to do with his speeches in the 1950s. Did that work with you?
Well, you remember Jawaharlal Nehru's speeches better than I do because obviously I'm much older. But I think his speech today was like delivering a fireside chat on the ramparts of Red Fort. It was a very domesticated speech, about women, about cleanliness, about hygiene, and how we could combat these things at the domestic level, really. He asked parents, why are you behaving this way with your daughters? He didn't talk about big social issues. He went straight to the parents and the household. And I thought that was very different from what we usually hear. What was also interesting was in this fireside kind of chat that he delivered on the Red Fort was that when there was no arithmetic attached to anything. There were no big numbers, which is why I think in some ways perhaps he was addressing those poor school children in the front rows who have to bear this whole ordeal. And this is something that they could take back home. That's something they could get their heads around. And in that sense, probably it was more or less like what you mentioned about Jawaharlal Nehru.
Shekhar Gupta, I noticed that he referred to himself as Pradhan Sevak, not Pradhan Mantri. He very pointedly said that in fact India had been built by its people, not by politicians, not by government. In your eyes, was that just appealing, clever rhetoric, or was it actually a point of substance that needed to be made?
Well, he's a politician, so it is also appealing rhetoric, but also it fits in with his personality. If, say, Rajiv Gandhi had said the same thing, it would not have sounded convincing, because if you come from privilege, then when you say this, you sound like a hypocrite. But Modi does not come from privilege. In fact, he comes from the opposite end of the spectrum. So when he says this, it does carry some meaning. In fact, he also took a crack at himself about selling tea at one point. He said, "Chai wale ka bhi bhala hota hai, jab chai wale ki baat aati hai, to I feel happy." So, so that I think was clever. But I think the most important thing is this was the most domestic speech that I have heard, at least in my memory since I've been a journalist, from a Prime Minister on Independence Day. It was totally devoid of foreign policy content, almost.
I'll take that up in a big way a bit later on. Alec Padmasi, the Prime Minister said he wanted to awake what he called the Shakti and strength of government, from the common chaprasi all the way to the senior-most cabinet secretary. As someone who understands messages in particular, do you believe that that's a message that will resonate far more with the rural classes of India and perhaps poor urban Indians than it will with cynical middle-class Indians?
No, I must say that it was a powerful performance. As a stage person, I can tell you that Mr. Modi is a consummate actor. He is able to use not only his voice, which Nehru did, but he uses gestures and he's very forceful. In fact, I get the feeling that he is so involved in what he's saying that sometimes the aggression, he has a very aggressive attitude. Even the way he walks is kind of a lean forward, like the bull stance. And the way he uses his pointing his finger and the way he turns his head, it's very forceful. And in some senses, I think it's good. In some senses, I think he'll run into trouble later on. But what amazed me was the content. He talked about communalism, and that communalism and riots and all were disturbing the country, so was casteism. But on his record, he's going to find it very difficult to meet the opposition taunts,
okay,
which will definitely come after the speech. And the second part was about women. But female infanticide in Gujarat are shocking numbers. So what are we talking about? Here's a Prime Minister who's talking about, he's totally against communalism, which, I don't know, the critics are bound to jump on him, and to talk about women, and Gujarat doesn't have a very good record.
Okay.
But I will say that as a Prime Minister and as a leader of a nation of 1.3 billion people, he certainly is very forceful, and I've always said, but it tended to be rather not a fireside chat. The fireside chat was invented by President Roosevelt,
okay,
Franklin Delano, and that was a fatherly talk. Here was a talk of someone who was punching the air, pointing the finger, swiftly turning, full of vigor. I was very impressed by his vigor.
Okay.
But I would certainly never call it a fireside chat, which is a fatherly, paternalistic kind of chat.
That's a difference of opinion.
Appearance.
That's a difference of opinion that you have with Dipankar Gupta. and maybe you're both right in characterizing it individually the way you want. But let's move now to the contents. And Shobha, let me begin by putting to you, do you believe that there was a clear political message, or at least a sense of direction, with a clear note of reconciliation? I noticed that the Prime Minister praised previous governments. He spoke of communal harmony. He stressed the need for consensus rather than majority. And there was a moment when I said to myself, is he trying very hard to put behind him the divisive election campaign we've been through, and perhaps even to overcome the polarization in our polity that we've witnessed in the last 2 months? Would you agree with that interpretation?
Definitely, Karan. I think that was again a very powerful message he was sending out. Yes, I would also say his approach and his body language was of a person completely in charge, avuncular rather than fatherly perhaps. But I still maintain that I was disappointed. There was no grand posturing, fine. There was no sort of grandstanding, fine. But there was no huge, big single statement he was making about, say, foreign policy. He talked about digital India, great. But the overemphasis on toilets and cleanliness was more appropriate, I would think, to a mayor discussing it, with the municipality or at that level. It just seemed a waste of a very, very significant, important historical moment. Everybody, the world was looking at what he was going to say, and I don't know what the takeaway is in terms of foreign policy or any even political comment about the way forward for his own party. With the kind of mandates that they have, I would have hoped for a vision statement. I didn't find one. It was a fairly low-key, very sort of domestic kind of a speech that you would make in a village panchayat.
All right.
Not something appropriate for the Red Fort, from the ramparts of the Red Fort. Nothing in comparison to the great speeches we've heard from some of our leaders. Yes, for the last 10 years, it was a non-speech from the ramparts. And yes, to Modi's credit, he didn't have a teleprompter. I think it's a bit of a
Can I stop you there? Let's not cram in too many things into one answer, because it becomes very difficult for the audience to actually pick up the main point of what you're saying. Let me come back to that thought I put to Shobha and I'll put it to you. Do you believe there was in fact a clear political direction when he spoke about communal harmony, when he spoke about consensus rather than majority, when he spoke about, in particular, praise for previous governments? Was he trying to reconcile the divides that have occurred in Indian politics, or am I overreading?
No, not at all. I think that was the objective, and if you're reading it that way, I think he's been successful, because this was a very inclusive speech and this was a reaching out speech. There was no criticism of anybody except maybe some self-criticism in terms of Indian society and males of Indian society or parents in Indian society, when he put the onus of rapes on boys instead of girls and families. So I think this was a very cleverly thought out thing, and I don't quite mind a Prime Minister not using Independence Day to make larger foreign policy statements, because usually those statements are either platitudes or threats. It's avoidable, both are avoidable. One is boring and one is avoidable.
You know, Dipankar Gupta, up till now there was a lot of concern, and you voiced it on my programs in particular, about the manner in which communal incidents are occurring and the silence from the government each time something happens. And we often felt in studio discussions that the Prime Minister should speak out. He has now spoken out and spoken quite forcefully, or at least emotively, about communal harmony. Has he made up for his silence, or does he need to do more?
I think he hasn't made up really. It's a statement of intent. You must also remember there's a bit of, I think, amnesia at work. He doesn't remember there's a man called Balian in his cabinet who's been charged with all kinds of things in Muzaffarnagar. You know, it's one thing to say that I want to keep the Saffron Brigade in check, also to admonish other political parties for their identity politics. But the fact of the matter is the real test lies in whether or not you are willing to punish the guilty. And that is where the rub lies. I think all of this talk about communalism could be, short-shrifted. We give a simple, plain answer. Are we willing to take the matters head on and actually criminally prosecute them, or are we going to just play around with words?
Alec, I'm going to ask you the same question, because I think it's such an important issue. I'd like a second opinion. As you view the Prime Minister's comments about the need for communal harmony, and he did speak a fair amount on that issue, did it to you suggest that this was an attempt by a Prime Minister who has been branded by 2002 to try and move on? Did it seem to you as if this was a way that he was trying to now comment on issues that have happened in the last 2 months which he's been silent on? Or do you think he's been ineffective?
No, I think it was a very clever speech in that sense, particularly on communism, which he talked about several times. But I would say basically, how is he going to, I absolutely agree with the last speaker, that we need action. It's wonderful for politicians to give us words, but we're sick and tired of the words we've heard from the Congress party ever since 1947. And we voted Modi in because we thought he's a man of action. I found very few action points. I found a lot of wonderful concepts, but a concept is only as effective as the action that turns it into something that people can feel. And yes, punishment of criminals, whether they are black marketers, whether they are communalists, whatever, is a very important part. And let's see, after this speech, what is the reaction of his own party? Because a lot of people, a lot of his own party have been speaking the opposite, absolutely the opposite of what the party leader has spoken. And they have been jumping up and screaming and shouting,
let's not anticipate and speculate about what his partymen will say, because we don't know at the moment. Let's wait for that. Let's wait for that. I want to bring in General Malik and put to you, I want to put to General Malik the concern that Shobha Dey expressed. She felt, in a sense, that there were so many little things the Prime Minister was talking about, that the comment he made about the need for communal harmony, the need for consensus, perhaps got drowned out by the multitude of other subjects. And as a result, there wasn't also a single dominating vision. Do you share that concern that there were too many little things and no one issue stood out sufficiently to leave an imprint?
Karan, we must remember the audience that he had. He's not making a speech in the parliament or to people who help him make policies. He is speaking now to 1.2 billion people in the country, and today everybody is hearing him either on the TV channels or on the radios, and both in urban areas as well as in rural areas. So he is addressing an audience which understands the kind of language that he spoke today, and you don't expect a person with that kind of an audience to be speaking on major policy issues. But he did speak about the common issues which are affecting the men and women of this country today. And to that extent, I thought he was quite practical in his approach and his intention. I agree that at the moment he has conveyed his intention. The implementation part has yet to follow.
Coming, Mr. Shesai, to the economic content, would you say that just as there was, and Shekhar agreed on that point, a clear political direction in terms of reconciliation, on the economic front, would you say there was a clear economic direction, perhaps encapsulated by that phrase, come, make in India, and then sell anywhere in the world?
I'm absolutely captivated by that. In fact, I think there was a very strong economic message. In fact, one of the comments that I was making at the time of the budget was that there was no specific proposal with regard to the manufacturing growth, and one had expected to hear that manufacturing for export, having India develop as a shop floor for the world was one large missing piece in the economic policy, because without that you can't have economic growth. And there it was, and it was very well articulated. And as I said earlier, I think it goes beyond that. He is talking about being modern in the approach, talking about zero defect, zero effect. I think it might be a very pithy statement to make, but it's a phenomenal statement to make. That's the language of a developed country.
Can I pick you up on that? Can I interrupt and pick you up on that? You know, you're referring to, in fact, the enormous stress the Prime Minister laid on manufacturing. That's the context in which he talked about zero defect, zero effect. He also spoke about the need for import substitution and maximizing exports. In fact, he said he would like every corner of the world to be filled with goods which said made in India. But he didn't actually give us details about how this would happen. Don't you think that this was just intent, and what was needed was further details of policy which were missing?
For sure. I think if we don't get to hear the details in the forthcoming budget or even earlier, then of course this would be a letdown. Here is a vision, but it's not backed by action. But I hope and I do believe that action will follow. Whatever we have seen so far, at least in the parliament so far, there's been a fairly productive use of time. So one would expect that action will follow on policies as well. So I think we should not prejudge this issue. But what has been stated is, I think, profound.
What you're saying is that the intent is clear and obvious, action must follow, but you're patient and you're willing to give a certain amount more time to see that action. On the economic front again, Shekhar, I noticed that there was one very important thing he said. He said, the world has changed and India cannot sit alone in a corner. He said, we have to think the way the world does. As a journalist, would you say that there was a clear hint here that we're going to see far-reaching reforms in terms of labor, finance, investment, and perhaps deepening India's involvement in globalization?
Well, yes. In fact, we've complained for a long time that reformers have done their job in India by stealth. They've never tried to build public opinion. In fact, they are like bus drivers who signal left and turn right. So it's good to have a Prime Minister on Independence Day actually talking reformist language instead of being defensive about it. Instead of saying there is no choice but to globalize, let us see, there will be challenges. That is not the language. But at the same time, I would have liked to see more action in that front. There's been some.
Again, more detail.
No, not in the speech, but in the days leading up to the speech. There's been FDI opening up in some areas, but look, defense should have been more than 49%. We could have had a more positive approach to WTO, a more reformist, modern, global approach to WTO. So some of those things make you still hold your judgment.
Can I in fact put this to you? On the one hand, you have a Prime Minister who says India can't sit alone in a corner. And on the other hand, the same Prime Minister has scuppered pretty effectively the WTO trade facilitation agreement. Is there a contradiction in the two?
In the company of Venezuela,
Bolivia,
and I think Cuba.
Yeah.
Right?
So India is sitting in a corner. There's a contradiction here, isn't there?
Yes, and I think that sometimes suggests to me that the big job in India is governance reforms, because India is now effectively globalized. India's economy, society has globalized, but India's governance structures are not globalized. So the same bureaucrats are dealing with these issues as did in the past.
There is one area where I suppose, Dipankar Gupta, there is a fair amount of detail the Prime Minister offered in terms of a new policy that will have major economic effects. It's what he called the Prime Minister's Jan Dhan Yojana, which will ensure bank accounts for all poor people with a debit card and a 1 lakh insurance. How much of an impact will that have, A, on the economy and more importantly on the lives of the poor who now become beneficiaries of these accounts?
Well, it will have a great effect provided it can be done properly. If you have the problems with internet in many parts of the country, then people whose hopes have been raised, if those aspirations are not met, then they turn very bitter. And we found that in the last few years when there was this very concerted attempt towards financial inclusion. The ideas were very good, intentions were good, but the technology just didn't match up. And that is why it didn't work. On this 1 lakh business, I think again, you need insurance. Of course, the poor need insurance. And that would be a very good thing if that could be done through this Aadhaar card or whatever. On the question of globalization, let me just add one thing. I think what the Prime Minister was saying was not so much in terms of administration of globalization. What he really wanted to say was that you have to wake up and manufacture at the scale and quality and technological sophistication at which the rest of the world is, or else you'll be left behind.
And that underlies the question I asked Shekhar, that you can only do it if you have necessary reforms. Labor being perhaps the most difficult, land acquisition being another very difficult one. But you need to reform to be able to achieve that scale and to put yourself in position to compete with China.
I get the point, but the fact really is that administration and WTO and FDI and so forth are not central in this scheme of things. Labor reform is, land is, and what is most important
But those are often the two most difficult.
Well, that's all right. The most important thing is that you must get the Indian entrepreneurs to be entrepreneurs for God's sake and not just businessmen.
And that is something that perhaps Mr. Modi is particularly good at because he understands the entrepreneurial instinct and the need to support and nurture it. Is that a yes or a no?
Well, I think Gujarat hasn't shown that much entrepreneurship, it's shown more business acumen.
And there's a difference between the two?
Yes, entrepreneurs always innovate. That is a Schumpeterian model. Businessmen make money.
All right. Therefore, entrepreneurship requires the initiation of certain talent and skill, and that's one step further.
And that is made in India. That's the mantra, if I understand correctly.
Shubhade, I want to come now beyond broad economic and political directions that were contained in that speech to perhaps a few specifics. One of the things the Prime Minister said and it was particularly noted, was that he's an outsider in Delhi. He said he wasn't part of the world of the capital. And he said when he came, he was astonished to find that instead of one government that was cohesive, you had many governments that were quarreling with each other, taking each other to court, fighting with each other. As someone who is yourself an outsider to Delhi, but actually knows and understands Delhi very well, do you agree with his characterization? Do you think he spotted an essential truth, or is he exaggerating?
But he has exaggerated it only up to a point, Karan. I think he wanted to make a statement about being an outsider. There was another reference also to how chaiwalas can succeed in today's India. So I have no problem with that. I think what I would give him really full marks for as an outsider who could have fallen prey to the temptation of name calling, the blame game, talking about the Nehrus and Gandhis, talking about the previous administration. He could have done that. It would have sounded spiteful perhaps, petty perhaps. It's a temptation that he resisted, and I think all credit should be given to him for that. Talking as an outsider who is now an insider is definitely strategically a very smart move. It shows that he plans to stay an outsider till he becomes a complete insider, if he ever becomes that, and that will give him the strength he's looking for. It will give him the objectivity that is needed.
Okay.
And also it will break up this little nexus which we've been putting up with for far too long, of everybody in Delhi is an insider, everybody belongs to a clique. Here comes someone from the outside, he's giving inputs from the outside which are on the whole positive and in the interest of the country. So very good if it actually means that.
Okay.